So, during most of this course, we're going to assume that firms maximize profits, as I mentioned. But a natural question is whether this is either what firms should do or what they in fact do in the real world. And for the moment, let's assume that the owners of the company, the shareholders, actually want them to be doing this. And I'll talk about whether that's the case or not in a moment. But notice that, one reason why the shareholders may want them to maximize profit, even if the shareholders has, a whole set of goals on its own, is that those profits get paid back to the shareholder. And once the shareholder gets that money back, he can do with it whatever he wants. He can give it to charity, he can use it to buy a new house, whatever purpose he has, he can spend the profits that the company makes on it. So the question is, should managers try to accomplish this goal? And the advocates of so-called corporate social responsibility say the answer is no. They say that it's the responsibility of companies to worry about things like poverty, the externalities caused by the company, and other broader social goals, and that they shouldn't just focus on maximizing profit. So Milton Friedman, in the article that you had to read, pretty forcefully argues against this view. Christine, could you tell me why Friedman is skeptical of corporate social responsibility?
He tends to think that it should be only the individuals who own the corporation who should be donating to charitable causes.
Yeah.
Because as he's saying, a CEO tends to make the decision about whether to make donations and where. It's kind of a tax on the shareholders' money.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily an efficient one.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And so just to flesh that out a little bit more, his view is basically that managers are like, a machine that is controlled by the owner, and that it's not the job of the machine to correct the machine operator in terms of what, it should do with the machine. Basically, managers purpose is to figure out how is the best way to achieve what the shareholders want to achieve, rather than to choose the goals. And that basically by pursuing the goals, the managers are basically imposing a tax or stealing from the shareholders, right? And, if the company's creating externalities, that's the job of the government to fix it, not the job of the manager to unilaterally decide, what externalities exist or not. Yeah? Remind me of your name?
David Hampton.
David Hampton, yeah.
What I don't quite understand, I guess, I was arguing, he seems to really focus on ownership. Like, his big problem is that it's not the manager's money to be doing things. But like in the case of an externality, isn't that inflicting a cost on somebody else? So in a way, you're making them spend money. So like you're inflicting a cost upon them. It seems like more or less the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely counter arguments to be made against this, but I think the basic problem is that, look, imagine that there's some awful polluter who's doing lots of terrible, dumping tons of toxic waste into the river. Would you think it would be a very good idea for like some vigilante to come along, decide that this guy was imposing an externality even though the government hadn't done anything about it, and like steal a bunch of money from this guy or blow up his factory? Probably not. And the reason is because, we think that you start allowing stuff like that and things degenerate into chaos, that like it's not really his social role to like decide whether that's what's going on or not, and so forth. And in some sense, I think, exactly what Christine was articulating is that that's exactly what a manager does when he doesn't maximize the profits for his shareholders. Because really, he was hired for a particular purpose, right? Now, it may be that we should tax the shareholders, or that we should, throw them in jail, or there's lots of things we might want to do. But the idea that it would be the job of the manager to decide that seems a little bit inappropriate. And similarly, if the shareholders, want to pursue a goal like that, why don't they just take the profits that they get out and, use those profits to do what they want? So, basically, unless it's helping the firms sell to consumers, And I think that's a lot of why companies do corporate social responsibility, is that they think people will like their product if they think that they're socially responsible. And in fact, sometimes companies can get that without even doing anything socially responsible, just by looking cool. So like Apple, everyone, if you take a survey of people of how corporate social responsibility, what companies they think are best on corporate social responsibility, everyone puts like Apple near the top. Because Apple's so cool, it must be doing lots of corporate social responsibility stuff. But in reality, they don't do anything. So it's just completely false. Anyway, so most economists are pretty sympathetic to Friedman's perspective because they accept in the cases when an executive has a social goal and is willing to accept less pay from the company in exchange for being able to pursue his social goal, in which case he's really spending his own money rather than the company's money. Right? Okay. So some have made a more modest sort of corporate social responsibility claim, not that managers should just deal with externalities or social goals or sort of broader things, but just that they should try to help sort of the direct stakeholders of the firm. So people like workers or consumers. And in fact, this is exactly what the idea of a cooperative is, right? If you're owned partially by your consumers and your workers, you're going to look out for their interests and not just the interests of shareholders. Yeah?
Isn't that, just by saying something like, saying that like they should look out for workers and consumers assumes that the company isn't doing that, and you wouldn't it seems like a rational profit maximizing firm would want to look out for their consumers because that means the consumers will return, so it's in their interest to have it.
What's your name?
Ben Jacobson.
Ben.
Or the workers, like you want happy workers because that means they'll be better profit maximizers. So like
Yeah.
that statement to me.
Well,
seems
that's
like
true. I mean, we'll see in this course, though, that there are definitely ways in which the firm will do things that won't be fully in the interest of consumers.
Sure.
And so you might think that they should do things that are more in the interest of consumers than just their profit motive would give them an
But
incentive.
then Friedman would just argue, right, that well, then the government law about that, and it should be the responsibility of the firm.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there's more to the stakeholder society view than there is to like the broad externality view. And in fact, it works quite well in cooperatives. I think there is some real evidence that cooperatives work better in the interests of consumers, at least in some cases, than do standard corporations. So I think there's some case for that, but I think even this most economists, or at least many economists, are skeptical of, because I think they would argue that the basic problem is there's a fundamental difference. If you think of a company as being like, something that a bunch of people make together that is good for all of them, one component is the workers, one component is the people who fund the company, and one component is the people who consume, right? And there's a basic difference between the people who fund it and the people who work or consume, which is that if I stop liking Pepsi, I don't have to drink Pepsi anymore. If I don't like working at a Pepsi factory, hopefully if the economy is not as bad as it is now, I can find a job somewhere else, right? Whereas the shareholders, once they've given their money to Pepsi, who cares about them, right? I mean, the money is now in the other person's hand. They might as well run off with it and do whatever they like, unless there's some legal or ethical restrictions which get the company to look out for the interests of the shareholders. The shareholders are going to be, just completely screwed, right? And what that means is not just, it might be a good idea to steal from people who are shareholders. They might be too rich and we might want to redistribute wealth from them, and we'll talk about redistribution later. But the problem is that if you do it through the corporation not looking out for their interests, no one's going to give their money to companies. And then you're not going to get the company starting up, and then no one's going to be employed and no one's going to be able to buy products, right? So if you undermine the ability of shareholders to recover their money, you really undermine the ability of the whole economic system to work. You can certainly pursue some of these other goals you have in other ways, but in the same way that if you let people commit all sorts of crime, rather than having the government redistribute wealth, people would be hiding all their stuff, and you would have chaos. And similarly, you wouldn't really have a functioning investment system if you didn't have strong legal and ethical protections for shareholders, because people just wouldn't give their money to companies. And we'll talk about what happens when people don't give their money to companies in a few slides. So I think this leads most economists to believe that the primary goal of corporate governance should be to protect the value or profit of shareholders. So the problem, though, is what the heck does profit even mean, right? So a naive definition of profits is just the amount that I sell times the price I sell it for minus cost. But in most real world settings, this is a completely meaningless quantity, even though we're going to use it in the course a lot, because for a number of reasons. So first of all, there's a basic difference between economic and accounting profits. Julie Dorkin? Julie, can you give an example of a difference between economic and accounting profits?
Well, in economic profits, there's more the concern with opportunity cost. So say I were to work for Starbucks, and like devoting my time there, I give up the opportunity cost of money spent working elsewhere, or money I could have gained working for someone else.
Yeah, that's right. So if you ran a Starbucks franchise yourself, right, you shouldn't count as part of your economic profit, even though you would count as part of your accounting profit, the labor that you put into the firm, basically, right? And how much you could have made if you were working some other job rather than running the Starbucks. That's exactly right. So that's one issue. Another manifestation of that is that a larger company is always going to be generating more profits unless it's totally incompetent, right? But that doesn't mean that just by getting larger, a company is actually doing better, right? Because imagine that I have, currently 100 shareholders, right? And now I'm going to increase my number of shareholders 10 times, right? Float a bunch of shares, get a bunch more money, and invest that. And now my, profits go up. And my profit per original shareholder might well go down as a result of that, right? And so the original shareholders don't want you to do that. So the real thing that matters is how maximizing the profit per current shareholder and not the total amount of profits that the company is generating. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. A second problem arises from the fact that companies do things over time, right? They don't just make all their decisions and get all their profits at one date. And profits in the future are not worth as much as profits today are worth. Because profits today can be invested and you can make a return on those, right? So you should be discounting the profits in the future. But on the other hand, you shouldn't either only care about today's profits and completely forget about the future. So there's this delicate balancing act of how you discount future profits to both put some value on time, but also not to be too short-termist. A third problem is uncertainty. So you may not know what's going to maximize profits. And if you're uncertain, the only thing you can do is maximize expected profits. But even that doesn't make very much sense, because first of all, people may disagree on what they expect the consequences of various different things the firm does to be. Second, people care about risk as well. If the company's taking a ton of risk, even if its expected profits are high, that might not be a very good course of action. And different people might have different attitudes towards the types of risks the company takes. Yeah, what's your name?
My name's Andy, but it will say Cindy Hall on my
Okay.
numbers.
Yeah? Wait, what's your question?
Well, I was just going to say, doesn't this sort of bring in the ideas brought in the next article? What was his name? Coase?
Yeah?
Yeah, because he mentions about uncertainty bringing two problems, and one of which is entrepreneurs can only forecast the demands and sort of set their production level to that. But then also the market can drive technology and all those forecasts by itself. That's why it's firms.
Yeah, so uncertainty causes tons of problems, and it shows up in tons of places. But one place where it shows up is the effect that it has on what's the right notion of profits for firms to use. So one solution, which I think most companies basically follow, is they try to maximize the stock market value. So this idea is supposed to take into account uncertainty, it's supposed to take into account discounted present value, and so forth. So Shin?
Yes.
Shin, what are some problems with using stock market value as a basis for figuring out what a company's worth?
Because in the stock market today, the investors aren't just looking at the discounted future stream of cash flow,
Yeah.
but actually market volatility and many other macroeconomic factors.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think